I get the distinct pleasure of talking to you guys today all about how to raise rent. Now, raising rent is an important topic. I know some of you are probably wondering, is this going to be recorded? Do I need to take notes live? Good news, this is all going to be recorded. We will send you the recording and the deck within 2 business days. So keep an eye on your email. We also have an entire library of webinars on turbotenant.com/education/webinars. That link will be in that follow-up email. So again, don't feel like you have to memorize it, but we always have this education available for you. So please check it out after we're done with this session. So when it comes to talking about how to raise rent, it can be, as I'm sure you've experienced, a bit of a sticky subject. The way that I prefer to approach it is like a high school debate exercise. So really what we're going to do today, I'm going to help you understand how to evaluate the circumstances that are, surrounding your rental and your business. That includes some of the macro trends, inflation across the nation, things of that nature, but also some of the more unique details for your property, like how much you've invested in it. From there, we're also going to look at best practices in terms of raising rent, how to have that conversation, situations in which you cannot raise rent. And then, of course, once you've gathered all of that data, I'm going to talk to you about how to properly communicate that to your tenants so that you don't tank your relationship. So with all of this in mind, there are a few key points that I really want you to take away from today. If we had to boil it down just to 3, you're going to understand if you should raise rent based on analyzing your business costs and the local market. So I will walk you through how to do those things. Then, of course, one of my main focuses and passions here at TurboTenant is the landlord-tenant relationship. And I know, again, raising rent can be a friction point. So I'm going to give you some tips on how to leverage the data and the research that you've done in order to have a really constructive conversation with your tenant and still make sure that you're getting that good return on investment as you move through. And of course, at the heart of all of this is communication. So beyond the data gathering, communication is going to be the second most, well, really one of the most critical aspects of making sure that this goes smoothly. And I'm going to give you those tools throughout this presentation. All right. So you might have thought, well, I can just kick back and relax and listen to Krista say words. Not yet. I'm curious, audience, how often do you raise rent? We have a quick little poll that'll help me understand what you're currently doing. And of course, we'll move through, according to the presentation. I will say these response options are, they were a bit tricky to come up with because of course people have different lease lengths that they prefer. So choose the one that makes the most sense for you and feel free to put some clarifications in the chat as well. By and large, a lot of the landlords who use our platform have long-term leases, so 12 months or longer. So oftentimes, admittedly, that's the first thing that pops to mind for me, but I know it's a bit of a different ballgame when you have midterm and short-term rentals and you're trying to get those priced. So most of this talk is going to be about really angled toward that long-term mindset. However, there are still really key takeaways that you can utilize if you have short-term and midterm rentals in your portfolio too. So let's go ahead and take a look at these results. It seems that most of you raise rent after each lease expires. Now, there's a really good reason for that, and I will go into it just in terms of ease of the process and communication, etc. We have other folks saying, I raise rent every year. A healthy portion of you have made some notes in the chat. Let's see. Thomas increases rents when costs increase. That makes sense. Annabella says every couple of years. It varies, excuse me, based on increase in expenses, etc. Yeah, totally makes sense. Once a year, not for 2 years during the pandemic. Thank you for these details. Really appreciate it. Okay. So it's good to understand, one, when your fellow landlords are also raising rent. We'll get into some of the more typical practices. They're going to fall in line with what you saw in that poll. But continue chatting away in the chat, leave questions as they pop up in the Q&A, and let's start building our debate argument by looking at the current landscape of rentals. Specifically, we want to take a look at America as a whole, right? I'm sure you guys have been feeling the pinch of inflation. I know I certainly have. And that has really impacted every aspect of life, including how much it costs to rent a unit. So according to Zillow, rent prices are actually up year over year in 48 of the 50 biggest metros, and that's of June 2024. So recent information. The highest rent increase was actually in Hartford, Connecticut, followed by Cleveland, Louisville, Providence, and Milwaukee. If I said Louisville wrong, you can correct me, but please be nice. I don't know how to say your city's name. All of this is to say they are seeing significant, in fact, the highest rent increases. Hartford had a 7.8% year over year rent increase, which is considerably higher than the typical rent increase, which we will get into here shortly. Also, rent is 31.4% higher than pre-pandemic rates. That is boosting up the average rent across the nation to over $2,000 as of June. That means that the average renter must make at least $82,148 to follow the 30% rule. If you're unfamiliar with the 30% rule, that is a best practice for renters, which basically says they should spend 30% of their gross income on rent or less per month in order to be in a healthy financial state. So that is by and large what folks, a pretty standard industry practice, I'd say, especially as you're screening applicants. Most people want to see that the applicant can follow that rule. It's getting harder and harder as prices increase. If we look at this on a property type level, single family rents tend to increase more frequently, well, in higher degrees, I should say. So that is up 4.7% year over year, whereas multifamily rents are up only 2.7% year over year. At the same time, rent has risen at 1.5 times the rate of wage increases in the United States, which is, again, just painting a full picture. I want you to be able to speak to the landscape because this will help you connect with your tenant. Even if you do decide, hey, raising rent is what I need to do, having this in your back pocket and being able to speak to it clearly will help preserve your relationship and still get you what you need. So that's why we're going through it. All right. So just a quick graph here to illustrate the percentages of household income spent on rent. This is from, excuse me, allergies. This is from constructioncoverage.com. So as you can see here, most folks end up spending 30% or more on rent on average, right? So this is just over 50%. Now, admittedly, one thing that I don't like about this graph and that I am going to do differently in our next round of industry surveys is the 30%, the end, that like bucket limit of the rule is included in the higher amount here. So it's really hard to discern how many people are at 30% or lower. So keep your eyes on your inboxes. I send out bi-monthly surveys. So every other month, I'm sending out a survey to you and to our renter audience to get a sense of what's going on in the rental industry. And I will be checking on this. This is data from a different company called constructioncoverage.com. It's still worth looking at, but I just wanted to acknowledge that one point. I would be not doing my job as a researcher if I didn't point that out. Interesting to see, though. Most folks are really not falling into these smaller categories, which again is just further context about building the argument to raise rent. Now that we've talked about some of the costs, let's talk about the wages in clearer focus. So as I mentioned previously, in order to follow the 30% rule, the average renter needs to make a little over $82,000 per year. Unfortunately, the average salary is $63,795 nationwide. So that is roughly what, $19,000 difference between what people can afford and still follow the 30% rule on average versus the reality of the situation. And of course, money doesn't move the same way across the United States. So down here we have a breakdown from Forbes about the regional average wage. So you'll see the Northeast, by and large, gets paid higher wages on average compared to the South, which is on the very low end here at $54,718. And just to illustrate this with a quick visual, this graph comes from Zillow. This is from June 2024. As you can see, this blue line represents the share of income spent on rent. So right now it's at that 30% limit on average. Hey, that's pretty good, right? And then you see here that the typical renter income needed to afford an average rent is still considerably higher than what we see being paid out to renters. At the same time, as I mentioned, inflation strikes everyone across the board, and especially as small business owners, you can start really feeling the burn. So when we look at some of the costs there, you can see with this graph from the US Bureau of Labor Statistics as presented by CNBC, there is we've been on quite a journey, right? We've had some really high highs, miserable times. I remember them, and I'm sure you do too. And right now, if we take out food and energy, inflation sits at 3.3%. If that's included, all items sit at 3%. So things are increasing in price. With that said, you're probably seeing this, especially in terms of higher operational costs. One of the first things to actually pick up an increase when inflation increases are insurance premiums. So I'm curious if you guys have been seeing that the way I have, but that is by and large the most frequently increased cost when inflation increases, along with, of course, utilities. So that would be energy, as mentioned here, along with all of your typical utilities. If you use a property manager, their costs have likely also increased. So just something to keep in mind. If you wanted to cut down on that, you could use TurboTenant for free. Sign up today at turbotenant.com. But for now, let's continue on. We've got the landscape of what things are looking like currently. We understand that it's quite a sticky situation, which means it requires some nuance. And again, just building up a case so that you can speak confidently to whatever plan you decide to follow for your business. So you might be asking yourself, well, should I raise rent? And we're going to get into that in just a second. I'm going to take a quick peek at the chat. Jerry, that's a great question. I'm going to save it for the end because we're going to hit on some points that contribute to the answer, but I see you and we will answer that. Okay. Jen confirms getting hammered by insurance and utilities in California. Noreen says the same. We're not specifically going to talk about landlord insurance today, but Lexi, if you don't mind, there is a webinar that we did about landlord insurance. If you could drop that in the chat along with the webinar on property taxes, I think that would be really fantastic. Or it might be a video on property taxes. We have covered both of those things before. Would love to share those resources with you. And Lexi is, of course, my wizard on the back end, helping out, answering questions, finding links. So she is pretty wonderful. Alan, I'm not sure which bit you are referring to, but good to know that you're renting to couples who each make 60K on average. Oh, household income versus individual income. Yeah, fair. It's important to know the difference. Let's see. Lots of stuff going on. Okay, things are moving. All right. Okay, Lexi is covering some of these great questions about finding different resources. Alyssa, there is a resource section. Lexi, if you could drop the education page, that would be wonderful. And we will continue moving on to the next part of building out our argument, which is figuring out if you should raise rent. So, as I've mentioned, there are a couple steps that I want you to take before you raise rent. Not only will this help you understand how much you can raise rent, but also it'll help you communicate it really effectively. However, the timeline of how often you do this is up to you. So I say here to complete this on an annual basis. If it makes more sense for you to do it more frequently, you certainly can. We'll get into some of that here shortly about how often you can increase rent. But I wouldn't go longer than a year without taking a look at my business costs, my local rent laws, and considering how much value I've added to the rental. You might be wondering, well, why these 3 steps in particular? It's really because, again, we are structuring an argument, and going through these 3 steps will help you approach raising rent thoughtfully and analytically. So first, we're going to go into the business cost step, then we'll talk about laws, and then finally follow up with added value and why that's important. Analyzing business costs, that really thrills some people, and to them, I say kudos. I think that oftentimes, having a really good system in place will help make sure that you're on top of these things. If you slip or you're not dedicated to expense tracking. TurboTenant certainly makes it easier so that you can plug in your expenses and have more of this available to just look over at a high level view. If you are someone who's currently doing it yourself in a spreadsheet, that is certainly one way to go about it. However, you are currently setting up your expense tracking, it's really important to make sure that you have a handle on how you've been impacted by the local economy, but also the broader economy, right? So specifically, I want you to look to see which of your bills have increased and by how much. Now you can follow these steps for any kind of rent increase or any kind of increase in bills. So if you have like let's say a utility bill and it's only gone up by an average of $20 per month, that's still $20 coming out of your pocket possibly. So it's worth reaching out to them and trying to negotiate lower costs. One of the top tips I have here is your property taxes and your insurance premiums. I know I mentioned them on an earlier slide. The reason for that, if you call your landlord insurance provider, you can ask them how to reduce your bill. Sometimes it's as simple as, hey, we want you to add a security system, which you might be like, Krista, that's not very simple, but you could get a Ring doorbell or otherwise whatever their specification is. Adding additional security can be one way where they cut down on your premium because it helps to feel like your property is safer. And they might have other suggestions that will help you control costs without sacrificing quality, even if they don't, right? Even if you call your landlord insurance provider and they say, sorry, there's nothing that we can do, you then have this in your back pocket. So when you talk to your tenant about increasing rent, you can let them know that you took steps to try and mitigate the impact on them by reaching out. And unfortunately, that didn't work out, XYZ, right? Again, we're building a case. Additionally, when it comes to property taxes, it is absolutely possible to appeal your property taxes. We do have a video with more information. Like I mentioned at the top of this presentation, we will be recording everything and sending over the deck and the playback of this discussion. So you can click on this link when I send it over to you. But inherently, you can either appeal your property taxes yourself, or we partner with a wonderful program that can do it for you. Property taxes can be a little bit tricky to appeal yourself, especially because there is a very strict timeline of when you are eligible to make that appeal and kick it all off. But please watch that video for more information. All right, so now we have an understanding of how our business is doing, what kind of impacts we've seen from inflation. We've made the moves to try and lower costs by reaching out to these different entities, especially the ones that are costing us the most. Your next step, of course, is going to be to consider your local laws. And truly, these first two steps, I will admit, they could be interchangeable. You could look at your local laws first. You could look at your business costs first. I think it's a best practice to just always try and have a pulse on your business costs. And similarly, your local laws can change pretty quickly. So it makes sense to make sure that you are always keeping up to date, especially before you make any kind of announcement to your tenant or otherwise change the terms of the lease if you have an active lease. With that in mind, you need to be checking to see if there are any restrictions on how often or how much you can raise rent in your state and county. So sorry. We have a little map here. Inherently, anything in green has some level of rent control. The blue, especially dark blue, means that the state has prohibited the adoption of local rent control, meaning in those states you cannot enact rent control, right? And then, of course, we have some gray where it just says, nope, there are no laws there, or there are partial laws prohibiting rent control laws. Gets a little sticky. But really what you want to focus on here is if you are in one of these states or DC, there is some level of rent control policy that you need to be aware of. And this is of 2022. So again, make sure that you are checking to see what's going on where you live. You can start your research with us. We have a great page that lists out all the different states. And then, of course, I want you to go on to your local.gov site and see what they are saying to make sure that you have the most up-to-date information. All right. So from there, I want you to consider the added value. So if you have upgraded appliances or installed new windows to improve your tenant's day-to-day living, they'll be better primed to understand why rent has to go up. And the more obvious those value adds have been, the easier the rent conversation is going to go, because they see, okay, my landlord cares. They are also invested in this. It makes sense. They told me all about, like, inflation has hit their business as well. So this increase is easier to tolerate. We're all in this together. Hurrah, right? It's an important step. And I would say one of the biggest takeaways here is that it's not when you are a landlord, what you have to do is really just try and be good all of the time, right? Like, you don't want to be a good landlord, a communicative landlord only around like a rent increase, and then you're really hard to reach the rest of the year or the rest of whatever the lease. Instead, maintaining that professional relationship is really going to help you achieve the business outcomes that you want without causing undue friction, hopefully, with your tenant. It's impossible to predict, right? But I'm going to give you some tips and tricks to make sure that when you do go down this route and you have the conversation, it's as streamlined and easy as possible. With that in mind, I want you to make sure throughout the time that you are landlording, you are staying on top of your maintenance requests and tenant communications. You want to strive for that clear professional communication and just keep them looped in as you find solutions to maintenance issues. That way, they feel more connected to the rental. It helps make that conversation go easier, and they're more likely to accept the rent increase, which saves you from a vacancy cycle where you could be losing money. As you put this piece of the argument together, just be very realistic about what you're offering. Again, if you are hard to get a hold of, or you have a property manager and you're not sure how easy they are to get a hold of, I would dig in and try and collect some of that data so that I could feel really confident going into the conversation with my tenant. Okay. All right. So we've gone through the top 3 steps before you go to increase rent to figure out what your next move will be. Now I'm curious, in terms of those of you who have actually increased rent, which factor do you consider to be most important out of the ones we've listed here? There are quite a few, and there's also a combination of the above answer. If you choose that combo answer, I would love for you to break it down in the chat, what you're thinking, and take a second and look at that. Oh, man. Fun. It's cool to see what you guys are saying here. We've got some great information about how people approach rent. Erica's dad trained her to always raise rent annually, even if it's minimal increases. Offering a credit for X months of rent to still have rent increased. Cool. That's a cool incentive. Okay. Folks are saying, hey, people don't care about costs. It's true. There are going to be some tenants who they're like, okay, interesting. But there are also going to be some tenants who really take it to heart, especially if you guys have a positive relationship outside of this conversation, right? It's hard to build goodwill in a conversation where you are telling someone you're going to be charging them more in any situation. I'm sure you felt the same. Maybe there's an insurance provider that you love most of the time, and then you see the bill that comes up for your yearly premium, and you're like, that guy is no longer my favorite. But there are also going to be people who really respond to that kind of information. Okay, folks are saying combo answer is an increase in property taxes, cost of improvements, and increasing operating expenses. Rents are always below market rates, so when I increase a little every couple of years, they never mind. Emily says area rental prices and our cost. Jennifer, okay, great stuff. Yes, thank you. So quite a few of you, in fact, the majority here said it was some combination of the above. So thank you for sharing those answers in the chat. Feel free to ask each other about yours. But other than that, the second most popular answer was changes in fair market rent, which isn't surprising, right? Let's get into some of the evaluation of those bits and bobs. Well, I should say, we will. First, I want to talk to you about situations in which you cannot raise rent. Okay, so first and foremost, if you are not legally allowed to raise rent, don't do it because you will get in trouble. Even if it goes smoothly, let's say you're not aware that you live in a place that has some form of rent control law, And let's say that there's a frequency cap, because that's something that we see in those 200 local counties. It could be that you're only allowed to raise rent every year, and oh no, your costs have increased, so you're trying to raise rent twice this year. If you do that and it's not legal where you live, you can get into a court case, which you don't really want to, right? Obviously, you don't. It's going to be costly, it's going to be frustrating, it's going to be hard, and you're unlikely to win. So really staying up to date on what is allowed in your area is going to be highly critical. That's one of the, if you forget everything else besides communicate with your tenant, do your research, treat this like a debate, looking at your laws, please let that be something you take away from today. And all of our content, really, we want you to stay up to date so that you can protect your business. But there are other situations that might be a little bit less obvious, like if you are raising rent as a retaliatory action. So let's say that's one of your tenants goes to the city and they say, hey, there are code violations, a code inspector comes out. If you were to then raise rent on that tenant, you would want to make sure that you are not doing it as a way to punish them for bringing in an outside party to evaluate your code violations, right? Again, I want you to do your research so that if there is a justifiable market reason to raise rent, you know it, rather than saying, hey, I don't like this person, or maybe I'm going to charge families, an extra $200 in rent because they're so noisy and kids, lead to greater wear and tear. That would also be a situation in which you cannot raise rent. That would be considered increasing rent based on protected class attributes, which is a no-go. Additionally, if you fail to provide adequate notice, which is going to be determined by where you live and the local laws there, or I should say where your rental is and where its local laws are, then your tenant does not have to abide by the rent increase. If you have a rent-controlled property specifically, maybe you are providing public housing or you're otherwise in like New York City, which has many rent-controlled buildings, you cannot, again, go against that and raise the rent. That would get you into some trouble. And of course, same kind of vein, if your renting price is now going to be higher than what the local law allows based on your property type and location, it's a no-go. So make sure that you are being very thoughtful when you are considering whether or not you should raise rent, because again, I do not want you to get into a situation where you're appearing in front of a judge and you get into a lot of trouble, you risk your bottom line, it can really spiral, right? Okay. If you were curious, I think this is just an interesting example. When it comes to property types, I also want you to take that into consideration as you are looking over your laws. So I bring this up because I learned that in Colorado, mobile home lot providers have their own specific rules about when they can raise rent compared to other landlords. So just make sure that you are getting as detailed as possible with your research so that you understand exactly what you can do and what is within your rights. Okay. When in doubt, make sure that you consult a local real estate attorney before moving forward with any kind of communications with your tenants. That'll help protect you at the end of the day. All right. So we've talked about when you can't raise rent. Let's assume you've done your research, you know that you need to raise rent, but you're trying to figure out exactly how much it should increase, right? There are a couple different ways to find this answer. First, you should know that the average rent increase is like 3.5% as of June of 2024. Where legal, rent increases tend to fall between 2 and 5% on average annually. However, I want you to be strategic about your rent increases. I don't know if you've noticed from the rest of this presentation, but strategy is really the name of the game as you go to try and make this happen, right? So that means really breaking it down to brass tacks and understanding exactly what you want to do in your scenario before you have any of that communication with your tenant. With that in mind, part of the strategy, again, is just making sure that you're analyzing your market at least every year. That'll help you avoid a situation in which rent has to jump up significantly to bring it back up to market value, right? So if you increase rent by $50 to $100 on an annual basis, let's say, just to throw out some easy numbers, that's an easy sale. That's pretty straightforward for your tenants to understand. If it jumps up by like $800, it's likely to sour your relationship, and it's also likely to lead to a vacancy, which again, we'll talk about how to evaluate your risk there and what your market looks like, but it's something worth keeping in mind. So there are two main scenarios when it comes to increasing rent that we're going to take a look at here today. Increasing rent when you have no tenant and increasing rent when there is an active lease. So let's start with arguably the more simple one, which is increasing rent during vacancy. So first off, as always, I will say it until I'm blue in the face, check your local laws. It's just a best practice, and I want to make sure that you stay safe. But also, I mention it here because there are some states that even when you have a vacancy, restrict how much you can increase the rent. So, and when I say states, it's really county on the county level. So just make sure that you understand what you can and cannot do. Many times when I have these conversations, chit-chatting with landlords, and y'all will say, I have no one in there, so I can raise the rent. And by and large, that's true. And for the few of you who are in places where that is not true, I just want you to be aware and make sure that you are feeling confident moving through. So if you can move forward without limitations, your research now becomes a focus on your local housing market and then comparing your property to similar properties nearby as part of that. Really what we want to look at with the housing market is market saturation. So if your market is saturated, if there are plenty of rentals available for tenants, then it's something to keep in mind as you consider how much to raise rent, right? So if there are, let's say, 3 open units for every tenant looking for a rental, it's going to be very risky to increase the rent for your average unit. If you have a luxury unit or you have something really unique that is a huge driver, sometimes it's a location, oftentimes I would say, or specific amenities, you are playing by slightly different rules, but it's still worth considering how saturated your market is in order to inform how much you want to increase rent. Signs of market saturation are going to include high or rapidly increasing vacancy rates. Of course, an increase in rental incentives. So I want you to make sure you're scoping out your competition. If you start seeing that people are offering like, a free month of rent if you sign up today, or waiving your application fee, XYZ, and it's really happening all over the place, pause. That could be a sign that they are struggling to get people in, and you want to take that into account as you determine how much to increase rent. Also, if you see an increase in multifamily developments, that is a sign that your market could be saturated pretty quickly, depending on the level of completion of those developments, right? I remember once I was living in Greenwood Village. If you're not from Colorado, it's kind of a nice, swanky-ish part of town. And I turned around one day and there were 4 new giant multifamily buildings that had just popped up overnight. And that market got very saturated very fast. So you just want to be aware of that as you move forward. Another thing that you might not have thought about before is population decreases. If you are seeing that people are moving away from your area, from where your rental is, keep that in mind because that could inform how long it takes for you to find a new tenant. And that is all part of the recipe in terms of finding out how much you want to increase rent or need to. So now that we have some of these broad strokes about how to analyze the housing market, we're going to get more specific about things outside of just the saturation rate. Okay. Let me wet the whistle here for a second. All right. So when it comes to analyzing your local housing market, I would like you to follow some advice from Rent Magazine. Specifically, consider how popular your property's location is. As I mentioned, if your rental's in a really poppin' spot, it's more likely that you can charge a higher rent or enact a rent increase more easily. You also want to consider how your property type performs in this area. As I mentioned at the very beginning of this presentation, single family home rentals, rent prices have actually increased higher than their multifamily peers. So take a look at what your rental is, all of these different attributes, and use that to help guide the conversation about this rent increase. Lastly, of course, we've kind of touched on this, current economic trends. So that's the market saturation piece, but also consider local and national inflation rates, vacancy cycles, and your local tenant base. Right now, the average US vacancy rate is 6.6%, and 42% of vacant units have been empty for less than 2 months, just to give you some color. And in fact, let's give a little bit more color with a handy dandy graph. So once again, you're going to see that vacancy rates really depend, they shift based on the unit, or excuse me, based on the region that your property is in. So this is another graph from Construction Coverage, and it came from June 2024. You can see that the South and the Midwest are experiencing the highest rental vacancy rates. Again, just worth considering as you decide what to do for raising rent. Going back to raising rent during a vacancy, you've done your research. Now you need one more component of that research, which is to understand how your rental compares to other ones in the area. I saw this getting mentioned in the chat. It's really smart. We have a free rent estimate report to help you understand a range of prices being charged for similar properties in your area. Now, again, this is really aimed at long-term rentals. So if you have a midterm or a short term, you want to make adjustments and do just a bit of additional research looking at specific sites with properties like yours, whether that's Airbnb or what have you, to make sure that you're giving yourself this range. But this can help you understand what people are charging by and large where your property is. And then it's up to you to determine where it falls here. So for example, if you have some really killer amenities, maybe you cover lawn care and you also, I don't know, have a free parking spot for your tenants, you could possibly be in this higher end, right? So again, taking a really analytical view of your property will help you figure out where it falls in this range, and then you can move forward with confidence if your rental is significantly below, or not even significantly, if it's just below where it should be based on how much you've invested in it and all of these other factors. If you are in a vacancy cycle, you're looking to enact this new rent, go ahead and create your listing on TurboTenant.com. You can create it for free. We will send it out to dozens of sites, including apartments.com and rent.com. We even have an AI tool to help you write it very quickly and while following the Fair Housing Act. So it's worth checking out. And this should be, hopefully, pretty easy peasy, right? There is no tenant. You don't have to have a conversation necessarily with someone. There's not a set expectation. All of those factors come into play when we consider raising rent with an existing tenant. However, some of this is going to be the same, right? So once again, I want you to analyze your market, look at saturation rates, population increases, decreases, what's going on with your local inflation rates and national inflation rates, etc. Compare your rental to similar properties online using our free rent estimate report tool. And of course, considering how you've added to the property since the last rent increase, this piece is really dedicated to the situation in which you have an existing tenant, right? Because again, there's a set expectation and they've had whatever experiences with you up until that point that you need to weigh in as you decide if you want to increase rent and by how much. From there, you need to make sure that you are looking up the minimum notice requirement for your state and county. Perhaps your city too. Sometimes different cities have their own rules. New York City, for example, stands out as one that is playing by its own rules. So make sure you understand how much notice you are required to give and follow it to the letter. In fact, if you could give more notice than less, that's a best practice. I'll touch on that again a little bit later. And then, of course, you're going to communicate with your tenants that this rent increase is happening, right? I know that's a lot. We're going to unpack this here in the next section of our presentation, but this is a good pause point to just see what we have going on. Okay, Noreen, great questions. So Noreen asked, how soon can we tell a 12-month rental we are raising rent? Is it 30 to 60 days? It's going to depend on where you live. So I would go to turbotenant.com/state, that's STATE, and click on your state where the rental is located. That should be a good jumping off point for some of this research. By and large, for a 12-month rental, again, check your local laws, but typically it's 30 to 90 days notice is what you're required to give. And being able to give more notice than less is a good tool to help smooth out the conversation. All right. I went to turbotenant.com to list a property and could not find landlord login. Jerry, I'm going to ask you to try again. And if you don't see it, contact support@turbotenant.com because that's funky. Okay, sorry, the chat is moving really fast. So I apologize if I don't get to read yours out loud. Emily says, I have it in my contract that rent will be increased 2.9% per year if the contract is extended. So they have a year advance notice. Emily, that's a great practice. And actually, I talk a little bit later about language to put into your lease to preserve your right to increase rent. I will say, and based on, I'm going to leave it up to your experience because I haven't read your lease. I hope you are also giving them a written notice before that lease renews, just to remind them. I think that's still required. I'm not a lawyer, just a good looking researcher. But I'm 97% sure they still need some kind of notice within that time period, like a reminder that it's happening. But I'd be curious to hear your experience. Got some great information. How do you vet current potential tenants and how should it affect raising the rent amount? Mark, you can vet tenants through turbotenant.com. Inherently, they fill out a rental application and we run it through our systems to give you a comprehensive background, eviction where legally allowed, and everything else check so that you can feel confident about who's moving in. How should that impact raising rent? Well, one, you want to make sure that you have someone in there who can pay the rent as you set it for your original contract. You could try and keep in mind their qualifications from the beginning of your lease agreement when you go to raise rent again. If you do that through TurboTenant, you could go back to their account and reference their credit check. That might be tricky, or at least it adds an extra step. Whereas I think you could go through and look at the market data and do that research and then have the conversation, personally speaking. But vetting and having good tenants in there who are able to pay rent at the original lease agreement amount is critical, very critical. Okay, lots of stuff. So sorry, it's moving a little bit quickly. Let me check on time. I'm gonna try and answer one more. Michelle, does the rent estimate only include regular rent versus pet rent? My understanding is that it's an average of rents around the area. So it depends on how other listings are being written. If other landlords in your area are including the pet rent in their final rent amount, then it pulls that final rent amount, but it's hard to say. So I'd say if you are also allowing pet rent, you're going to want to factor that in and just take a look again at some of the other listings for your competitors in the area and see how they're doing it to help inform how you're doing it. All right. Fantastic. Okay. Can you raise parking fee to any amount under rent control? David, that's a good question. I'm not sure of the answer. I would double check with a local attorney, especially if you live or operate under a rent control state. Cool. All right, great stuff going on in the chat. Let's keep going. I'm going to hit on some of your questions that I saw there as we move through the legal side of rent increases, but I really appreciate the back and forth that I'm seeing. So when it comes to the legality of rent increases, I've already had you take a look at your local laws. And the next most critical factor is, of course, the language that's in your lease and how long your lease is. So frankly, shorter leases are easier to increase rent on. You know, a month-to-month rental is really simple. Their notification period is usually much shorter than, let's say, a 12-month lease. Do your due diligence, look it up, but by and large, that is what we see. When you are considering your lease and the language therein, if you want to preserve your right to increase rent, what you want to do is make sure that you have some sample language, or excuse me, some language in there about the process. So how much notice the tenant can expect, how you'll deliver that notice. Really, that's a best practice. You should have that information in your lease in general. But if you want to get more specific and say, hey, I analyze the market on a yearly basis, these are the steps that I take, X, Y, Z, that's a really good way to just have it ironclad in your lease, assuming that follows your local laws, right? Like you can't just throw in a lease clause that violates or goes against whatever you have going on locally, but that is a really good tip. As Emily mentioned, she has a specific percentage in her lease to help cement what she's going to be doing for the next lease. So since you are live attendees of this webinar, we will be sending out a sample rent increase clause that you can put in your lease agreement. Please check it with your favorite landlord attorney. I am not an attorney, but that'll help you understand the kind of verbiage you can use to, again, just really cement your right to analyze the market and increase rent as needed, along with some of these other tidbits about how much notice you'll give. All right, before we move on, I should say I talked a bit about shorter leases. Long-term leases are a bit more challenging. So with a short-term lease, you might need to send, a notice to increase rent. You'll most definitely need to send it in writing, likely, and with a specific delivery method like certified mail. For a short-term rental, you might need to give a notice period of 10 to 30 days. Long-term leases, which I'm considering anything 12 months and higher, those typically need the 30 to 90 days written notice period. And that notice must be sent as outlined by your local laws. Okay. Your notice should specify what the new rent charge will be when it goes into effect, etc. I'm going to go into more detail about what to include in that notice here shortly. But once again, since you're here live, I will be sending you out a sample that you could take a look at and use once you get it vetted, or give it the old thumbs up from the legal end, because again, I am not a lawyer. But that can help you move through this conversation. All right. So regardless if you are waiting for your tenants to sign a new lease or you are enacting a rent increase during an active lease, please, please, please make sure that you are sending the proper amount of notice. That is critical, and you'd be surprised how often that gets missed. With that, you might be saying, wait, can I increase rent during an active lease? And the answer is maybe. Again, it's going to depend on where your rental is, the laws around that rental, and what you have written in your lease. So for example, an active Colorado 12-month lease usually locks in rent unless there is a specific rent increase clause in your lease. So again, I'll send you a sample of what that can look like, but it really pays to know that this is the law at play so that you can follow it accordingly if you are a Colorado landlord. Of course, even if you are raising rent during an active lease, you still need to make sure that you are following the specific notification stipulations, like the delivery method and timeline, to make sure that everything is on the up and up. All right. So as we round this out here, the next most important part, in fact, one of the most important parts, of anything that you're going to do as a landlord is communicating with your tenants. So you've done the research, you know you're going to increase rent, you know how much you're going to increase rent. Now it's time to let them know. As with any good debate, it really comes down to your messaging and the fundamentals therein. Once again, leaning on Rent Magazine, there are 3 suggestions that they made to make the rent increase conversation as easy as possible. One is, of course, advance notice. So if you have to give your tenants 30 to 60 days notice by law, but you have the opportunity to give them 90 days notice because you know that you're going to increase rent, that can help smooth out the conversation and also help them feel more prepared, give them more time to go over their finances, decide if they're going to stay or not, etc. So advance notice helps both of you out. Also, make sure that there's a clear explanation of the increase. Again, I know that there are some comments in the chat that sometimes renters don't care about that, but sometimes they really do. And I think, especially if you have a good rapport or even just a working business relationship, it shows the efforts that you made and the why of what's happening, which can make a rent increase easier to swallow. And finally, and arguably the most important part in terms of the legal side of things, your written documentation is key. So let's say that you do give your tenants a courtesy phone call to just gently break the news before you send that official notice, give them a chance to ask questions, etc. That's great. That's lovely. We highly recommend it. But I still want you to follow up with written documentation. If you didn't write it down, it didn't happen, and the courts will agree. So make sure that you are doing your due diligence and checking that off of your list, even when you've had a really wonderful phone conversation, face-to-face conversation, etc., about the rent increase. When it comes to that rent increase notice, again, giving them more time is going to help them with their planning, which can help you with your bottom line. When we break down that clearly communicate aspect, you just want to give them all the details they need to know in order to make a decision about what to do, right? So we've kept it pretty simple here. I go into way more detail on the next slide. And again, we will send you this deck, so please do not hurt your hands trying to whip it out really fast. Boiled down, three main things. You want to let them know how much the rent will increase, when that increase will go into place, and the next steps that you want them to take. Typically, as I mentioned, rent increases must be communicated either by certified mail or in some written form. Usually emails do not suffice. Again, check your local laws, but you want to make sure that you are doing this the right way. All right. So now really breaking it down, here's exactly what that rent increase notice should contain. Remember, the rent increase letter serves two purposes. It's communicating the increase to the tenant and also serves as documentation that you followed proper notification steps. So with that, there's quite a bit of information that you want to include. Beyond the obvious, like your name and contact information, you want to make sure that you are addressing each tenant by name in this rent increase. And if you are, if you have an active tenant, and this is like, let's say in the middle of their lease, for example, have very clear steps about what you want them to do next, right? So in addition to all of these other details, you want it to be so clear of their next steps that there's absolutely no question that they need to ask. Of course, don't shoo them away if they have questions and they want to talk to you about it. But, a lot of this means outlining, okay, you have X number of days to respond to this notice. If you'd like to move forward, I will need you to sign maybe a lease addendum saying that the new rent is X amount. Or if you don't want to move forward, I will need you to move out by Y date, right? Once again, you don't have to scribble all this down. Not only are we sending it to you, but there's also a free sample rent increase notice available at turbotenant.com/rent increase, and we'll be sending that to you since you are attending this webinar live. All right, I know that was a lot of information. I'm gonna stay here for a second. If you haven't signed up for TurboTenant, please check it out. We have a mobile app, both for landlords and tenants. We also have a premium subscription if you're interested. Now let me take a quick look at the chat and the Q&A to see what questions we have. All right, looks like some good conversations about best practices. Chris says, in Boulder near the university, I tend to keep rental rates the same if tenants are solid with on-time payments. So as each kid moves out after typically 3 years, we do our adjustment when creating a new lease. That makes a lot of sense to me. Lexi is killing it in the chat. Wonderful. Eric says he mails a notice letter and also emails the letter. I think that's great, Eric. I think that more communication is better than less. So good on you. What if the tenant doesn't sign the renewal lease agreement before the new rent increase starts? So I would make sure that your rent increase notice outlines how silence will be interpreted. Specifically, what I've seen folks have is something in there that says, if I don't receive a response by, let's say, July 27th, it will be assumed that you are moving out. We will serve you, or we will arrange a time to do your move out walkthrough XYZ. So you want to be very clear about what a lack of choice, how that's actually a choice. That can be tricky though, Jamie, I empathize with you. Eric provides rent amount, cost they pay for, and what the current low market rent is in the letter. I think that's a good idea. Okay, let's see. Elaine says, give over 60 days, give approximately 75 to 90 to allow tenant to view other options. Also give them the month-to-month rate of added $200 in my notice. That's another really good tip. I can't remember who asked the question. Jamie, that's something to highly consider, is Elaine's advice here of saying, hey, if you don't agree or you haven't made a choice, you will be moved to a month-to-month rate of a whatever increased cost. Okay, let's see what else. Is a walkthrough mandatory? So that's such a good question. I would say from all of my research, a walkthrough isn't necessarily mandatory. I would highly, highly recommend doing it, especially with your tenant, Peter, because it's not only a good idea, but it can help preserve It can help both of you be on the same page about the condition of the unit. Of course, you don't want to rely just on the experience of walking through. You want to be taking pictures and videos. But that way, if you can walk through and say, okay, so I see that there are 27 holes in the wall and you didn't patch them. So unfortunately, that's going to come out of your security deposit. It just sets the stage and the expectation. You still want to do all of the other stuff like, creating line items for each deposit charge that you're going to take. But so long way of saying, it depends on where you live. Check to make sure. I don't want to give blanket legal advice, but by and large, through my research, I have not seen a walkthrough be mandatory. What is the link again to the sample language for rent increase notice? Yeah, so that is going to be turbotenant.com/rent-increase. I'll be sending it to you too. So keep an eye on your email, Carolyn. Okay, yeah, Mohammed says in Washington, a walkthrough is mandatory or you can't withhold any of their deposit. That's good to know. Yeah, laws change so much, even, county to county. It's kind of wild. New York, exit and entrance inspections are mandatory. Nick, great question. Do you increase the security deposit with the rent increase? So again, check your local laws. Oftentimes you can. Now, with that in mind, if you are increasing rent and the security deposit at the same time, and this is a tenant who has been reliable and makes their payments, it could be really good for your relationship if you offer them a payment plan for the security deposit increase, especially depending on how much it's increasing, right? So let's say that you're increasing rent by $300. Then if you communicate that with your tenant and they say, hey, like, I'm okay with the rent increase, but needing to come up with an additional $300 might be tricky, you could offer to split it up into 2 payments and say, hey, pay me $150 this week and then $150 that week. And that can be really helpful. But yes, you can increase the security deposit with the rent increase. Again, just make sure you check your local laws. Jamie asks, what's the best resource to check your local laws? Yeah, so there are a couple different ways that you can go about it. First, I would recommend our educational page on different legal aspects, which is going to be turbotenant.com/state, which I've just dropped in there. That's a really good starting point. In terms of your local laws by county, what I would do is I would go to Google. I would Google the name of the county where my rental is located, and then rent increase and .gov. So to make that a little formula for you, I will type it in the chat. This is going to help you find a reliable government website that can give you more information. If you're still confused when you go to this website, call them, reach out by email. They will help you figure out what you need to do. And when in doubt, I would say also lean on your local HUD offices, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, I believe. I always get it wrong, but they will have information. Even if you're not a Section 8 landlord, they can be a really great resource. And I found the Colorado HUD office, the Denver one, is really responsive whenever I have questions. So just something to throw out there. All right, we are running low on time. So we have one quick ending poll that I would love to get you guys to weigh in on. And I will keep an eye on the chat and everything as well. Okay, so Q&A, we have a couple here. What do we do if our rents are lower than others in a building and you're going to make a very big raise and tenants are on a month-to-month? So first of all, Jerry, it is a tricky situation, especially when your rent is increasing quite a bit. I would say anticipate potential vacancy, and just know from a business perspective, you might need to be finding new tenants pretty quickly and evaluate whether or not that makes the very big rent increase worth it. If it does, then I would say if you can give the tenants more notice rather than less, that's going to be a really important aspect of trying to keep them in the rental with a very big increase, and being willing to work with them on some of the stuff, like if you are also increasing the security deposit, trying to put a plan into place where that's easier for them to do. What if you pay for some of the utilities? That's a good question. So if you pay for some of the utilities and that you can't negotiate them down, you can let your tenant know. If you're like, hey, unfortunately, rent has to increase by 100%, or no, $100, not 100%. That's going to be a tough sell. Then you can explain that, utility costs have increased, you called, but unfortunately there's nothing they can do. So this is what's going to be going on, kind of deal. All right. Guys, such nice words in the chat. Glenn, thank you so much. I really appreciate that. Sean, is communicating rent increases via email a bad practice? Uh, so it might be a dangerous practice, Sean, because most of the time there needs to be some kind of like official sign off that the person received that notice, which is why usually folks go for certified mail. When in doubt, communicate more versus less. So Eric mentioned that he sends a letter and he also sends an email. You can do that too. Okay. That would be my recommendation. All right. Oh, guys, you're being so sweet. Thank you for all of the kind words. And thank you to Lexi behind the scenes. She has been absolutely wonderful. If you have any questions, please let us know. We have a brief survey here at the very, very end, but it'll pop up once my silly little mug pops away. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day and hope to catch you at next week's webinar as well. Thank you so much.